Today on this episode of Going Deeper, we are starting a new season, we have a new set, and we're diving into the book of James. It's often considered one of the most controversial and confusing books, but we hope to shed a little bit of light onto this very interesting, short book of the New Testament. I'm your host, Kyle McCaskill.
I'm Becky Clark.
I'm Marie Burns.
So join us as we go deeper. So welcome officially to the new season, season 3, our new set that we have here. And I feel like we owe a little bit of an explanation to our listeners out there. We had promised a Q&A session for the end of season 2, but there was just one problem. We didn't get any questions. So if y'all have questions, if you want to see another Q&A session, because I've spoken to some of you in person out there, and you definitely expressed your enjoyment of the Q&A session. So come up with some more questions so we can give you some more answers. So keep them rolling, askgoingdeeper@gmail.com. If you have questions about this or any podcast episode that we have done in the past that you would like answered, and eventually, we'll get around to having all 5 of us back in the room again and having another fun Q&A session. But the reason we are here today is to get into the book of James. So I'm really just here to offer my,
You're the moral support.
I'm moral support.
If there was any book that we needed moral support for, it would be this book.
I'm here for y'all.
I don't know. Leviticus required a whole lot of moral support.
That one did too. Yeah, that's true.
But really, Marie and Becky, y'all both have done extensive preparation and research into the book of James, getting ready for a Bible study that begins very soon. It may have already begun by the time this podcast is released. But nonetheless, I'm assuming that we're going to be in James chapter 1.
No?
See?
Kind of and not, yes.
Kind of and not.
We'll talk about it.
I know the book of James is very confusing. It's often seen as very controversial because there's some very nuanced things in the book that probably need a little bit of explanation. So with that, y'all take it away.
Well, the first question is, who was James?
Yeah, I don't know. Next question. Okay. This is so easy. Questions, answers.
Well, who needs a Q&A session? We got
That's
this. Right. Okay, let me rephrase the question. Was it the brother of Jesus?
I don't know. Next question. Really, as I have been doing some work and reading, it's so funny because every commentary that I've read, and when we prepare for Bible studies, if you guys could see, like the amount of commentaries that we will gather together to read, and then we'll run into each other's office and be like, this person says something completely different from this person, and it's so frustrating. No commentator will agree, I guess, of who the author is. Most will lean towards the author of the Epistle James as being James, the brother of Jesus.
That's what I have read most often.
It's definitely the most common belief, but part of what calls that into question, I think, is when it was written, which is another I don't know answer. It could have been written much later than the brother of Jesus would have been alive.
Yeah, there's some the things that people lean upon to say it could be James, the brother of Jesus, is that we know from the book of Acts that James he becomes pretty prominent as a leader within the Christian church, the young church, the Church of the Way, which is what it was called in its early stages. And there are recordings of some letters that he has written. There's some recordings of some speeches that he gave. He and Peter spent a lot of time in Jerusalem and kind of leading from that area. So there's some stuff that was recorded in Acts that has similarity, and some of the writing that we have of James seems to be somewhat maybe similar just because of what they focus on. Right. But at the same time, James seems to, the brother James, who we're talking about in Acts, seems to have a much more organized way of writing and speaking.
Okay, so you're saying that
creates the issue then with the epistle, James.
Okay, so the epistle is not very organized compared to the James and Acts.
No. An interesting aspect of James that was brought to our attention through more than one resource, but a really cool one was the Bible Project. Their video on the book of James really drew out this key feature running throughout, which was that there are a lot of references to the Sermon on the Mount all throughout. So the joke in the office became that James wrote a daily devotional on the Sermon on the Mount, where he here, blessed are the poor in spirit, and here's my devotion to go with it. And somebody had these all together, and then they tripped and they fell and they scattered, and they just kind of raked them back together the best they could, because this book jumps all over the place, and it'll repeat some themes from earlier. They'll show up later, and it's related but not, and it doesn't flow. A
lot of commentators will try to show some consistency. There are multiple things that are mentioned multiple times, kind of in different ways. So there is some coherency to the book, and yet there's such randomness. And so that becomes the biggest issue about saying that James, the brother of Jesus, may not be the author of this book. And then there is the dating issue, and it has to do with because they don't know who it was definitively. Dating then becomes an issue, and then some people say, well, it based upon some of the things that are written, we think it was a much later date. And if it's a later date, then James, the brother of Jesus, has already he's gone. He's been martyred. And so it can't be him. So then they throw out, well, could it be James, one of the apostles? Well, then there's all kinds of other issues with that. Then it could be an anonymous person that they name James. And so those are typically the three kind of biggest options. But most people kind of say, we feel like it may be James, the brother of Jesus, and so we're going to lean there.
Okay.
So
I mean, that makes sense. And in the end, when we're asking the question, who wrote it for our own sake, really is that an important question to ask and to have a definitive answer? I mean, for some things, yes, but I don't know. I don't get too bogged down in authorship a lot of times because, well, there's people smarter than me decided what is in this book, totally. And so...
Well, the positive of knowing potentially who the author also gives us a date, which also gives us the idea of the crowd that they're writing to, context.
What could have been going on?
What they were really trying to address. And so when you don't have those things, sometimes it's just harder to kind of figure out, so what was the situation then?
Yeah.
So that we can go back to, because remember, what we always try to focus on is let's read it starting with the people who heard it first.
Yeah.
What was the intent for the original audience? And then from the original intent of that audience, then we start to pull out, so then how does it apply to this audience, which is us today? So when you don't have a definitive author, and when you don't have a definitive date, and you don't have a definitive audience, sometimes it makes it a little more difficult. And so that's a challenge for the book of James.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the book of James is just like it's what Marie said. It's like a hodgepodge in some ways. So it's a unique book that I don't know that it matters as much.
Okay. Well, but that being said, I mean, we know from some of Paul's more confusing and controversial writings that knowing the context, knowing the time and the date, and being able to put it in a time and space, it actually makes it credible. Because without some of that information, you would be like, okay, Paul, you're way off the reservation here and just not even in the right ballpark. But knowing in these more confusing instances, it really helps, I guess.
Yeah, and Paul and the Epistle of James seem to have a few things that maybe kind of bump up against each other. And they don't contradict each other, but there are a few things that Paul says that if you're reading the book of James and you know those things, or you're opposite, then you kind of go, wait a minute, one of them said kind of this and the other one said kind of this. And so then if you don't know the author and you don't know the context, then you start to, one of the biggest questions that people have is, well, does the Bible contradict itself? Can it possibly contradict itself? And then what do you do if it does? And so they don't, but there are some lines that kind of walk up to it. But again, understanding context and audience and things like that is really helpful. And we don't have that.
We'll run into two of those when I teach chapter 2, because you have James talking about it sounds like he's saying that you're judged by the law. And that's also where you find faith without works is dead. And Paul seems to speak very opposite to that. So we'll deal with two of those big ones just in chapter 2 of seemingly they say two very different things. And, I still kind of circle back around with that one on some commentaries, because it gets pretty nuanced at that point when they seem to say such opposite things. And at a glance, you can say, well, both can be true. And Except if you dig a little deeper, you start running into issues. So we'll be unpacking some of that when we get to chapter 2.
Okay. I look forward to that one.
Yep.
Yeah, it'll be good. I hope so anyway.
Interestingly, as I was studying, one of the other kind of controversial things about the book of James is it was one of the last books to make it into the canon.
Okay.
And so, it was disputed. Heavily disputed. Yeah, about should this be put in or not. And some of it had to do with the unclear author, the unclear time period, the unclear audience, and its style. What they say, the linguistic style of it is so unique and kind of different, because it's a hodgepodge of, if you read the book of James all the way through from start to finish, which is not a long book, so you could do it in one simple setting.
5 chapters.
Yeah. You will find that it sounds kind of like you're reading Proverbs or like, other wisdom books, because there's these like pithy sayings and all that kind of, but they just kind of jump out. It's not in the same organized way of Proverbs, where you've got kind of these sayings, these just very truth sayings that are very short. It's like you're kind of talking about one thing and then you got a little saying and you're like, whoa, whiplash here. And then you move on to something else. And so the style is a little bit like that, but then the style is also kind of a conversational action style. It's not really written like a letter. It doesn't even have an intro to it, and then it has no exit. There's no ending to it. It just it's like period, done.
Yeah, because it was very common in the other epistles for there to be an outro,
right?
Basically,
Yeah.
Where the intro is where you talk about, kind of the person who's receiving the letter, or the group of people who are receiving the letter, and typically then the outro is kind of those last bits that the author is either leaving that particular person or that group of people, or saying like, I'm hoping to see you soon, and I'm going to blah 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 place. We have none of that. We have a very, very, very small intro into the book of James, like one sentence, and the sentence is, James, the servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes and the dispersion. Well, who the heck are those
Yeah.
people? Because
And there's
that's
a lot of
past.
theories on that,
That's
too.
right. There's a lot of theories on that because when we were talking about the diaspora, that was really a time frame when the people of God had been scattered, when they'd been taken away by the Babylonians. Is that the second group of people?
Probably so.
Yes.
Syrians
first
are
was the
first,
Syrian.
Babylonians are second, and so the 12 tribes, which really we'd lost some of them by then, are completely scattered. So
Yeah.
when you talk about the diaspora, typically you're talking about the time before even Christ.
Okay, what is this word you're saying?
Diaspora. So it really just means the dispersion.
Oh, I gotcha.
I've heard some
Okay.
people pronounce it diaspora, if that helps.
Yes.
I've heard both.
This is a new word for me. I've learned something.
That's what they'll call it. Smart people will
Obviously, I'm not one.
make whatever assumptions you'd like to at this point. They will,
took a turn.
Sorry, that was a burn.
Oh,
I'm
I'm
very
just to sit
sorry.
back and
Scholars, of which I just read, will call it, which just means dispersion, group
Right.
of people
Gotcha.
broken up, kind of thing.
I see the.
And so
yes.
that is that's the area that they mark, the time period that they mark between when the people of God have been moved out by the Babylonians to when they finally come back in the time of the book of Nehemiah and things like that. So that's typically that mark. So we're not in that, though.
Right.
Right. And
Well,
so some talk about it. Maybe I think I found, and I'm sure you did too, that the general thinking is the audience is Jewish Christians, not Gentiles necessarily. So perhaps if the church is growing, a lot of them started getting pushed out of Jerusalem. And so maybe the 12 tribes is just kind of a nod to their heritage and not quite so literal. But again, we don't know.
Because we don't know who
Yeah.
the author was or the audience. So, yeah, it's just a guess. I mean, we know this is after Christ because of the content.
Right.
But what exactly even the intro means is still a little bit up in the air. It's just assumptions on our part because the author hadn't told us. And then there's no ending. So it was a very difficult book to kind of get back to. It was one of the last books that was chosen to be put into the Bible, the canon, because it just had kind of so many issues with it that made it hard.
Martin Luther was not a fan.
No, Martin Luther hated.
He really disliked this
He
book.
really, really disliked the book of James. Although, as I understand, John Wesley really loved the book of James. So
Well, John Wesley was a man of action driven by faith.
yeah.
So I can see where John Wesley would have really liked this book.
Which, if you want to hear more about that, that's one of the podcasts. That's the only podcast for the E100 that you, me, and Chris sat down and talked
Yeah.
about. We talked a little bit about the book of James,
Yeah.
and we talked about John Wesley.
Right.
So you can go back and
Yeah.
listen to that
If you'll-
one if you
That was a
want.
If you're watching on YouTube, up here in this corner, I'll link that episode. it's
There,
it's going to
in
be
that
here,
corner.
like they're on the screen, yeah, right there.
If you are not watching, then
That's right. If you're not watching,
Figure it out.
you heard me point to something and you didn't see it. I apologize.
right. So it's going to be an interesting book to study.
Would you like to tell people the real way to pronounce James?
Right. The Greek name for James is really Jacob or Jacob. Jacob.
That was news
You're
to me.
supposed to spit a little. It's supposed to come in your throat. Jacob. Jacob. Comes up from your.
So if you've named your child James after this book, I'm so sorry. You should have named him Jacob. Not really. But I mean, that
very
was
confusing.
That was an interesting little tidbit for me that it's
Yeah.
more like Jacob than James.
I'm seeing that how it's really strange. Yeah, I'm looking in my olive tree. Another
There you go.
nod to the olive tree with the Strong's tags in it. If you're
Bible
a,
Hub's good about that too.
yeah, if you're a digital person, I can't recommend the Olive Tree Bible app strongly enough, just because of the library that they have and the things that you can get through that.
The only other thing I would say is we're kind of introing into the book of James, which Marie already kind of mentioned. and we're heavily going to kind of pull this in, is that it really does seem like, even though James is somewhat disorganized, it really does seem that it pulls heavily from the Sermon on the Mount. If you go back and read chapter 5, 6, and 7 of the book of Matthew, which is where the Sermon on the Mount really sits. And when people think about the Sermon on the Mount, it's not just the blesseds portions.
Right.
It's those are the beginning parts of the Sermon on the Mount, but there's multiple things that Jesus covers. It's like he had a revival up there
it's
on the Mount.
Chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Matthew. And it shows up in one of the other Gospels for sure. But
Luke, I think Luke is the other one.
I often say that, to the people that think Jesus came to make our lives easier and everything, you need to read the Sermon on the Mount, because not only does Jesus not make our lives easier, he doubles down and makes adhering to the moral part of the law even more strict.
Yeah.
And so Jesus is not giving us a pass. He's narrowing the road even further.
right.
Yeah, so we're going to pull that in, because that was to me, it was very revolutionary when I heard it suggested by the Bible Project people. And then as I started reading some commentaries, they're not the only ones that have kind of compared it. And the more that you read them kind of side by side, the more you really see that James, whoever this author is, has said, that the teaching of Jesus, this teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, kind of encapsulates all of the things that Jesus wanted us as the people of God to know. That's all the learning, right? So now that Christ has come, he has come again, and has ascended to heaven and given us the Holy Spirit, it seems that James says it's time for us to really revisit that sermon. And here's how it's still applicable to us. And he just kind of pulls pieces and kind of addresses most of, I think, the Sermon on the Mount. I really don't know at this point. I think he covers almost everything that's said in 5, 6, and 7. I mean, even if it's one sentence, I mean, we talk about, I think there's one sentence in James towards the end where we talk about adultery.
He does.
We talk about the poor. We talk about work. We talk about caring for one another.
Caring for the needy.
The needy. Yeah, there's so much. I mean, then we have the stuff about the what you say, and being arrogant, or there's prayer towards the back, and all this kind of stuff. And so I feel like he pulls just about everything from the Sermon on the Mount, almost like he's got the sermon memorized, and then kind of says, "Oh, and I want to tell you this too. Don't forget this little thing too." So if you're going to study and follow along with us as we're podcasting, and we're going to film the studies as well to put on, my suggestion would be to also read on the front end the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, 6, and 7. It's not a long read.
No.
Giving us homework.
Yes. Well, homework is good. Homework is good. But I think looking at them together, we're going to do a lot of that.
Yes.
So.
Yep.
Okay, so with all that said, where are y'all going in your first lesson that you're going to teach?
The first lesson is really going to be a whole lot of kind of what we've talked about
the
here.
backstory,
Who is the author? What problems do we have in regard to not really knowing the author or the date? So then how do we read this book?
Okay.
How do we read it and interpret how it applies to us? And so that'll be a lot of our conversation. We'll talk about, are there any specific themes that we have within this book that will kind of come up over and over again? So it's a synopsis and kind of the first week. And then we struggled with how to teach this book, and we went multiple different ways and about how to do it. So we thought we could do it by theme instead of chapter by chapter, because chapter by chapter just seems kind of random. You're jumping around a lot. But we couldn't seem to make that work.
No, the idea of going by theme sounds like a good idea until you really try to get into it. And sometimes it's kind of hard to draw a line because of where he jumps. But things like your words and your actions, it pops out, caring for the poor and needy, that kind of thing. It just shows up at random points. It's hard to, so today we're going to cover chapter 2 verses, this and this, and also chapter 4 verses this and this, and also, and it just got very complicated. So Becky will teach the introductory this week, this Thursday, and then, or last Thursday, depending on when this airs. And from there, we'll go chapter by chapter. It's where we landed, but we tried to tackle it other ways.
So I guess another big question that I have that may come up is, why teach this book?
I don't know.
Next question.
We pick things like Leviticus and stuff. I don't know. We're just crazy.
Well, the only one that had any real reasoning behind it was when we went to Hebrews, because it was like the New Testament version of Leviticus.
Right. That I get, yeah.
I feel like sometimes we put all the books on of the Bible up and we throw a dart and we're like, oh, this one. And then we're like, why do we pick this one? This one's so hard.
Well, and we weren't even going to teach James this summer. We were going to go a completely different direction, and then we changed directions, and then we changed directions again. And Becky's like, "Hello, James." I'm like, "Okay," and it's nice and short. And
it's a good challenge, though. I mean, how long is the study going to be? It was a bigger challenge
than I expected.
This is only 6 weeks.
Only
it's
6
only
weeks.
A 6 week study. So a chapter a week essentially. And it'll be a quick read and a quick. I think that's one of the reasons we picked it for right now, because we're, depending on when you're listening to this, we're going into the summer.
It is the summer of 2021, and we are all busy, and we have children that do all kind of things. And so
we do, and we needed this is not all that to say, this hasn't been as easy of a bite as I thought it would be. However, we've got big plans for the fall and the spring that are going to be much more difficult.
Okay.
Yeah. So we were trying to take it easy, and yet I don't know about you, but this is.
Well, I think one of the
It's
other
not been
interesting
that
things
easy.
about the book of James is that it's probably one of the most quoted books. Of the pieces quoted of the Bible. It's because of the way it's written. It's got, again, these little kind of short little saying kind of things, snippets of things that are easily remembered, snippets of things that are very applicable. So most of the chapters are very well known.
So in that, I feel like any book, any passage that is heavily snippeted, I'm going to make up a word, that we often take those little snippets and use them for our own purposes instead of trying to use them in the way that the author / God, because, from our perspective, God is, inspiring and breathing this through the author. So let's maybe be careful with some of these snippets as we go through them and put some of them in the right places.
Right context.
Yeah. Okay. I can't wait to hear more of what y'all have to say about James, because I love these conversations, and I am the initial benefactor of all the work that y'all put in, because I get to sit here and just learn stuff and soak it up.
This has been good.
Yeah. So, but with that, I think we have some really great things to look forward to in the next 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks, however long we're going to be actually talking about this in podcast form. And so if you haven't already, if you're just finding us, make sure you subscribe. Write us a review on Apple Podcasts if that's where you're listening. On YouTube, like, share, comment, do all the things. You can also send your questions in the comments of the YouTube video.
Yeah.
And we'll get them there.
Yeah.
So you can either send us questions to askgoingdeeper@gmail.com, or just comment on the video and let us know that you're watching. And if you think somebody needs to hear the brilliance that is the theological minds of Becky and Marie on the book of James, share the video too. I know, no pressure. No, I'm putting all the pressure out there on our viewers and listeners for them to share and like and subscribe and do all the things. There's a notification bell on YouTube that you can click that you get notified whenever we do something new. But with that, I will say, any final words? No?
Good.
All right. We will see y'all next week. Thanks for listening.